Chief Adewale Johnson was no ordinary man. Known across Africa as a billionaire businessman with interests in oil, technology, and real estate, his name commanded respect wherever it was mentioned. People often described him as powerful, wealthy, and untouchable. Yet, very few really understood the man behind the billions. Unlike most billionaires, Adewale did not flaunt his lifestyle on social media or compete in the never-ending show of wealth. He lived in a mansion, yes, but he was not obsessed with luxury. His cars were expensive but functional. He had private jets but rarely used them for leisure. His life was measured, disciplined, and purposeful. But there was one thing about Adewale that few people outside his inner circle knew: he had once been a boy of poverty, hunger, and shame. Long before the Forbes list, long before the financial empires, he was a barefoot child in Ibadan who knew what it meant to go to bed with an empty stomach. This past shaped him. And it was about to reveal itself in the most unexpected way. One hot Friday afternoon, Adewale was being driven through Victoria Island. He had a meeting scheduled with foreign investors later in the evening. But instead of heading straight to his office, he asked his driver to stop at one of his restaurants. This particular restaurant was not a luxury five-star hotel. It was a medium-sized eatery he had established for ordinary Nigerians. The meals were affordable, the service quick, and the environment clean. For him, it was less about profit and more about creating jobs and giving the average worker a place to enjoy good food. Adewale entered quietly, wearing a simple shirt and cap. He wanted to see the restaurant without the usual fanfare. The staff recognized him instantly but respected his signal to act as though nothing was unusual. As he sat down to observe, he noticed something that made his heart tighten. At the far end of the restaurant, near the window, sat a woman with two children. Her clothes were torn, her face pale, her headscarf worn out. She sat quietly, trying to hide her despair. Her children, one a boy of about 7, the other a little girl of 4, clung to her sides. They were not eating. Instead, they stared at the plates of food being served around them. The smell of fried chicken, jollof rice, and plantain filled the air, but their table remained empty. The boy licked his lips unconsciously. The girl tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, I'm hungry." The mother's eyes welled with tears. She stroked her daughter's hair, whispering, "Be patient, my child." Adewale leaned back in his chair, his chest heavy. He had seen hunger before, he had lived it. He knew what it meant to desire food so badly that even the smell could make you dizzy. He knew what it felt like to be invisible in a room full of people eating while you had nothing. In that moment, he understood, this was no coincidence. Life had placed him in that restaurant, on that day, for this very reason. The waiter approached the woman and asked politely, "Madam, would you like to order?" She shook her head quickly, embarrassed. "No, we are waiting for someone," she lied, trying to cover her shame. The waiter, though sympathetic, had to attend to other customers and walked away. The woman bowed her head, avoiding eye contact with anyone. She wanted to disappear. She had not eaten a proper meal in 2 days, and her children had only managed a piece of dry bread that morning. She had come into the restaurant not because she could afford anything, but because the children were too weak to walk further in the sun. Her name was Miriam. She had once lived a decent life. Her husband had been a mechanic with a modest workshop. Together, they managed to survive. But tragedy struck 2 years earlier when her husband died in an accident. Since then, she had struggled to provide for her children. Jobs were scarce. Family support was almost non-existent. She had resorted to washing clothes for neighbors, selling vegetables, and even begging. On that particular day, she had nothing left. Not a single naira in her pocket. All she could give her children was hope. From across the room, Adewale watched everything. The memories of his own childhood came flooding back, standing outside a bakery, inhaling the smell of bread he could not afford, drinking Gary with no sugar for days, hearing his mother cry at night because she couldn't feed her children. The resemblance between his past and this woman's present was undeniable. He could not ignore it. Slowly, he stood up. The restaurant staff froze, curious about what their billionaire boss would do. The customers whispered among themselves. He walked straight to the woman's table. Miriam, embarrassed, immediately tried to get up. "I'm sorry, sir. We will leave now," she murmured, thinking he wanted them gone. But Adewale smiled gently and said, "No, please sit." His voice was calm, reassuring. He signaled to the waiter. "Bring the best meals you have. 2 plates of jollof rice with chicken, 1 plate of vegetable soup with pounded yam, fried plantain, and fresh juice for the children. And please, make it quick." The restaurant went silent. Customers stared. Staff exchanged surprised glances. Was the billionaire really ordering food for a woman who clearly had no money? Within minutes, steaming plates arrived. The aroma filled the air. The children's eyes lit up with excitement, and they hesitated until Adewale smiled and said, "Eat, my children." They dug in hungrily, devouring the food with innocent joy. The girl giggled as the juice touched her lips. The boy chewed greedily, sighing with relief. Miriam's tears flowed freely. She whispered, "Thank you, sir. God bless you." But Adewale was not done. Adewale pulled out a chair and sat with them. Everyone in the restaurant watched in awe as the billionaire ate with a poor woman and her children, laughing with them, encouraging them, treating them as if they were family. He listened to Miriam's story as she narrated her struggles. Her voice trembled as she described her late husband, the hardship, and the pain of watching her children starve. She admitted she had walked into the restaurant not to eat but to find shade and pray silently for a miracle. Adewale's eyes moistened. "Your prayer has been answered," he said softly. Then came the shock. He stood up and addressed the restaurant. "This woman and her children will never go hungry again. From today, she is employed in this restaurant chain. We will provide her with training, salary, and housing. Her children's education will be fully sponsored until university level. And I will personally ensure they are taken care of." The restaurant gasped. Customers clapped. Some cried. The staff could not believe what they were hearing. Miriam fell to her knees, weeping uncontrollably. "Sir, I have no words. May God bless you beyond measure." Adewale lifted her gently. "Stand up, madam. You don't kneel before men. You kneel only before God." News spread like wildfire. A passerby recorded the scene on his phone and uploaded it online. Within hours, the story of the billionaire who sat with a poor widow and changed her life went viral across Nigeria, then Africa, and finally the world. People were stunned. In an era where billionaires flaunted luxury, yachts, and private islands, here was a man who quietly used his wealth to lift others. But for Adewale, it was never about publicity. It was about memory. It was about pain. It was about never forgetting where he came from. The story of what happened inside that modest restaurant in Victoria Island spread like wildfire. By the next morning, videos had flooded social media, accompanied by captions such as, "The billionaire who sat with the poor," and, "The day Adewale Johnson shocked Lagos." But beyond the viral headlines, something deeper was happening. The act had touched a nerve in society. People who had grown accustomed to seeing displays of wealth were stunned to witness a billionaire not on a yacht in Monaco or at a gala in Paris, but seated quietly in a restaurant beside a widow and her hungry children. For Miriam, life turned upside down in the best possible way. Before that day, her life was a daily struggle for survival, washing neighbors' clothes for a few coins, walking miles to sell vegetables, begging silently for help when her children cried at night. But now, she had a steady job within Adewale's restaurant chain. The work was not glamorous, but it was honorable. She wore a clean uniform, served customers with dignity, and earned a salary that covered her needs. Adewale's promise had not been empty words. He ensured that her children were enrolled in school. The boy, who had been drifting toward street life, now wore a school uniform and carried books proudly. The little girl, once frail from malnutrition, now thrived in nursery school, learning songs and letters. Miriam was also moved into a small but comfortable two-bedroom apartment, paid for by Adewale's foundation. For the first time in years, she had a roof over her head that did not leak when it rained, and a front door that locked securely at night. The change in her demeanor was remarkable. The woman who once hid her face in shame now walked with her head high. Her smile, once rare, returned often. She began to dream again, not just for herself, but for her children's future. But the most surprising impact was not just on Miriam's family. It was on society at large. Nigerians across social classes were moved. In markets, buses, offices, and homes, people discussed the billionaire's act of kindness. On social media, hashtags like #KindnessLikeAdewale and #HumanityFirst began trending. People shared their own small acts of kindness, buying food for strangers, paying for students' transport fare, donating to orphanages. It was as if Adewale's action had unlocked something buried in people's hearts, the reminder that compassion was possible in a harsh world. Wealthy business owners who had once been criticized for indifference began re-evaluating their philanthropy. Some announced scholarship schemes. Others opened job opportunities for widows and single mothers. Several even visited hospitals to clear patients' bills. Ordinary citizens, too, caught the spirit. Taxi drivers offered free rides to stranded passengers. Street vendors gave extra food to hungry children. Teachers volunteered after school to help struggling students. The ripple effect was undeniable. Adewale's single act had lit a torch that spread from one life to thousands, perhaps millions. When journalists asked Adewale why he did what he did, he gave a simple answer. "I saw myself in that woman's children. Once upon a time, I was them." Hunger is not just a physical condition, it is an emotional wound. It tells you that you do not belong, that the world does not see you. I made a vow long ago that if God ever lifted me out of poverty, I would never turn my back on those who still suffer. He avoided interviews after that, insisting he did not want fame for his kindness. To him, kindness was not a spectacle but a responsibility. Still, his words circulated widely. In churches, pastors quoted him. In mosques, imams cited his humility. In classrooms, teachers told students his story as an example of leadership beyond money. Adewale had not only transformed Miriam's family. He had started a national conversation about what it meant to be truly successful. Months passed, but the memory of that day remained fresh. Miriam continued to work faithfully in the restaurant, growing into her role. Her children flourished in school, often visiting Adewale at his office to show him their report cards. To them, he was no longer just a billionaire, he was Uncle Adewale, a protector, a mentor, and the answer to their prayers. In one of the rare public speeches he delivered after the incident, Adewale addressed a gathering of young entrepreneurs. His words resonated deeply. We live in a time where wealth is flaunted more than it is shared. But wealth, if it does not touch lives, is poverty in disguise. Success is not measured by the number of cars in your garage or the houses in your estate. True success is measured by the number of people who can say, because of you, I am alive, I have hope, I can dream again. If God gave you resources, it was not just for you, it was so you could be His hand extended to others. The audience listened in pin-drop silence, many wiping tears. For once, they were not hearing about profit margins and return on investment, but about humanity and responsibility. Adewale reminded them that poverty was not an abstract problem, it had faces, names, and stories. It was Miriam, it was her son, it was her daughter. And lifting even one family out of despair could ignite hope for generations. For Miriam, the transformation was both external and internal. She no longer carried herself with the posture of defeat. She now radiated dignity, confidence, and gratitude. One Sunday morning, she stood before her church congregation and shared her testimony. She told them how she had walked into a restaurant with nothing but despair, and how God sent a man to change her story. The congregation wept, applauded, and took inspiration. Her children, too, were growing with purpose. The boy often told his teachers he wanted to be an engineer, just like my late father. The little girl wanted to be a doctor. Their dreams, once crushed by hunger, were alive again. Miriam understood that while Adewale had provided opportunities, it was her responsibility to seize them. She worked diligently, saved carefully, and even began helping other widows in her community. If someone could remember me in my darkest hour, she would say, then I too must remember others. The story of Adewale and Miriam was more than an inspirational headline. It was a lesson to humanity. In a world increasingly divided by wealth and poverty, it reminded people that compassion could bridge the gap. It showed that one act, whether feeding a family, sponsoring a child, or simply offering a kind word, could echo far beyond the moment. The message was simple yet profound: greatness is not in accumulation, but in distribution. And perhaps most importantly, it reminded the wealthy and the privileged that their blessings came with responsibility. As Adewale often said, God does not give wealth just for enjoyment, He gives it for assignment. Years later, when people looked back on Adewale's legacy, they did not just mention his oil companies, his technology startups, or his real estate empire. They spoke about that ordinary afternoon in an ordinary restaurant, when he sat with a widow and her children and treated them like royalty. That single moment became a symbol of hope, a turning point in conversations about wealth and humanity. It inspired thousands of acts of kindness across Africa and beyond. And for Miriam and her children, it was the day their lives were rewritten. From hunger to hope. From despair to dignity. From invisibility to inspiration. At its core, the story was not about money. It was about memory, empathy, and humanity. Adewale remembered what hunger felt like, and he chose to respond. Miriam remembered what despair felt like, and she chose to rise. Together, their stories merged into a testimony that continues to inspire. And so, the closing message remains clear for all who hear it. If you are wealthy, use your wealth to lift others. If you are struggling, never stop hoping. Your miracle may walk into your life when you least expect it. And if you are ordinary, remember that even small acts of kindness can create ripples far beyond your imagination. Because at the end of life, people may forget your titles, your cars, or your houses. But they will never forget how you made them feel, how you touched their lives, and how you chose humanity over indifference. And that, perhaps, is the greatest form of wealth. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Sparkles like this post to show your support for acts of kindness. Sparkles share it with friends and family so more people are inspired to help those in need. Sparkles subscribe/follow our page for more powerful real-life stories that remind us of the goodness still alive in our world. Backhand index pointing right: every click, every share, every comment helps spread hope and humanity. Be part of the movement. Let's keep kindness alive. Blue Heart.